Good morning, everyone, and I welcome you to this very interesting session on Indian Ocean and maritime security. As we see, we have five speakers in the panel, particularly in the schedule which was circulated to us before. But as I see, we have three participants. We have Dr. Frederic Grare, he's here. He's a senior research fellow, National Security College, Australian National University. We don't have Dr. Sitakanta Mishra. Perhaps we'll wait for him. We have Dr. Mauro Bonavita. He's too here. He is a lecturer in the King's College in London. Muhammad Shariful Islam is not here, but he had informed the panelists. We have Ms. Urbi Das. Urbi Das is from Jadavpur University, and she's given the title of a presentation too, which is India-US Relations amidst the maritime great game in the Indo-Pacific. And we don't have Don McLean Gill here. Yes, I think he's not here. So we start with the session. Given that we have 2 hours for the session, perhaps we can give around 20 minutes each to each speaker. We all know that maritime security is in fact an intersection of issues, not only talking about traditional but also non-traditional. It primarily sits, I would say, at the intersection of geoeconomics, geopolitics, and geoecology. In fact, one of the books that I teach in my class also is Sugata Bose on the history of the Indian Ocean region, where he says that the Indian Ocean region is an inter-regional arena of human interactions. And primarily, as he builds on his arguments, he says that the Indian Ocean is not only united through the human interactions that have happened over the space over a period of time, but also through the ecological factors where the tectonic waves, the tsunamis have also had a great impact in integrating the Indian Ocean region. So I think with the multiple challenges, with a very multi-layered character of issues that intersect at multiple levels, we'll perhaps proceed with this session. And I would now invite Dr. Frederic Grare to please start his presentation. Dr. Grare, you have around 20 minutes. And I would really appreciate if you could also tell us about what you will be speaking about so that we can have an overall overview of what the session is about. To you, Dr. Frederic Grare. I think so you are on mute, so you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much and for your very kind invitation, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on your time zone. What I had planned to do was to speak over 10 minutes. I don't know if N structured my presentation over those 10 minutes. What I will try to do over this the time which is allotted to me is try to look at the evolution that the Indian Ocean has experienced over the past 2 decades mostly. How China was a game changer. And when I say that, I do not imply any a priori hostility with it. What is the nature of the problems that we face today? What is the kind of dynamics that we're observing in the Indian Ocean, sort of multipolarization and so on? And what are the consequences for France? Because we all come from very different background, very different region. And of course, our perspective depends on where we stand. So let me start by saying that, gone is the time when the Indian Ocean was this neglected ocean, almost marginal compared to the Atlantic and the Pacific. Today, the Indian Ocean is a very strategic space, but a space which is still politically very fragmented, and a space which is, and this is perhaps a paradox, increasingly polarized. Why do I say that China is a game changer? Because what we feared before entering the era that we know now was sort of a vacuum in the Indian Ocean. All of a sudden, with China's rise, we have now sort of a fear that there will be too many actors, too powerful, and everything, and that the status quo that we experience in the region may change. So some may see it as positive, some may see it as negative. Mostly in the region, it's being seen as, well, by the major actor as negative, and by the others as somewhat positive. But there is a new reality. China is, did China became a game changer? Roughly in the mid-90s, when it became a net energy importer. That means growing relation with the Middle East. That means increased number of ships through the Indian Ocean. And therefore, all of a sudden, the region took a new strategic significance. In the process, what we've seen is not just a new actor emerging. We have seen a change of the entire strategic landscape. We used to categorize, as you said in your introduction, threats between traditional and non-traditional. Traditional referred to military threats. They were basically the space of the contest for sovereignty over territories and so on. But the non-traditional, and that's perhaps the most interesting, were related to the commons. It was a space where, in fact, cooperation was possible between state actors, where we could, in a way, socialize state into internationally accepted norms of behavior. And that's not exactly what happened. What we have seen is a blurring of the line between the two, and a growing confusion between traditional and non-traditional. There is a reason why we now speak of gray zone, we now speak of hybrid threat, and so on and so forth. And this is what makes it increasingly difficult to understand. This is what makes it increasingly interesting to study. What we've seen in particular is a double phenomenon of militarization. I mean, the arrival of China didn't mean just the arrival of China. It meant also that China did look for partners in the region, started building up relations with a number of littoral states. If we speak of militarization per se, we can mention Bangladesh, of course. We can mention on the other side, this is much more obvious to everyone, Pakistan. There was a long tradition, even before we entered the 2000s, of military relationship with Pakistan. This has only increased over the past 2 decades. But we also see China arriving elsewhere, exercising influence in a number of island states, exercising, using development aid in order to get political access, and so on and so forth. And what do we feel today mostly when we speak of the emergence of China is the use of the vulnerabilities of a number of littoral and island states in order for China to deploy another hostile state, and I could definitely mention Russia, for example, to deploy access denial capabilities in the entire region. I want to come back for a second on this connection between traditional and non-traditional actors. I mean, in 2008, all of a sudden, all major powers decided to act against piracy. I mean, the phenomenon had been growing since the early 2000s in the region. It was the outcome mostly of piracy in the Horn of Africa, as a result of the depletion of fish stocks due to illegal fishing and so on. We had a very interesting phenomenon because China was in no way present and active in this IUU fishing phenomenon then. Then China was called in as part of the anti-piracy operation, and in the process decided to build its own base. And once it was there, decided that it would cover up for its own ships. And now China is actually a big player in this IUU fishing operations. So we have gone from non-traditional to very traditional and very scary to most traditional actors in the area to non-traditional again, with a number of gray areas in between. And today, all states from Iran to South Africa are complaining about Chinese IUU fishing. Now, let me be very clear. China is not the only state which practices such things in the area. This is probably the only one who uses it for strategic purpose. And there is clearly there a very big difference between having diplomatic problems because, fishermen having this tendency to follow the fish, crossing into the territorial water or the sea of another country. But there is a clear distinction between doing that and using that for ulterior motives. And China is not doing exclusively that. I mean, it has the same kind of problems that everybody else has. What's interesting in this whole process is that 2008 was also the time of the economic crisis. This is also the time when that kind of problem propped up China in. So there was a sort of an waking up on the Chinese side on, weakened possibilities, invitation to participate in something else, which suddenly took a very different meaning. So, and the question of IUU fishing itself is interesting for another reason, which is that, in fact, China became major IUU fishing actor because in 2013, China decided all of a sudden to subsidize long-distance fishing fleet in order to preserve its own waters. But then it started a process of, behavior which is not specific to China, but in which China, being a very large fleet, plays a major role. So, as I said, what do we fear in the Indian Ocean? That countries potentially hostile deploy access denial capabilities that would definitely threaten the sea lane of communication in case of crisis. In case of peace, no one has an interest in doing any such things because we all depend on our trade on both sides. We all depend on our energy supply from the region and so on and so forth. In case of crisis, everything takes obviously a very different dimension. I spoke of political fragmentation, domestic vulnerability, and so on. These have definitely been enabling factor for external powers to find room for their own ambition by building ties with many of the little and island states. I mean, there is no need to provide examples here. The dynamics that we did observe in Sri Lanka, that we did observe in Maldives, and so on. And this is definitely not over. And there are other examples that speak to the point. China's growing presence has also been a vector of polarization, mostly with India, but not exclusively. Mostly with India because India feared being sidelined in its own region, and New Delhi has long considered China's presence in the area with suspicion. The Look East policy, initiated in 1992, the Look West policy with the Gulf, initiated in the mid-2000s, all been partly a response to China's growing power and influence in the region. Then starting in 2014, India accelerated its plan to build stronger ties with its partner in the region, whether in the Persian Gulf, in Southeast Asia, or in Africa, very often through cooperation with Japan. These multiple engagement evidence the level of concern in India regarding China political and economic initiative with its neighboring countries, and highlighted the reality of the rivalry with China. Now, there was, of course, the other, if not preeminent actor, the United States. I mean, it is quite clear today that in this context, the role of the US is unlikely to fade away. True, it is increasingly being questioned, but US military capability are still by far the most important one in the region, even if a general sense of strategic fatigue and the growing political reluctance in Washington to conduct intervention abroad eventually impact the local perception on the willingness and the ability of the US to shape the dynamics in the IOR. But, and that's a big but, if the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US government reflects a growing belief in Washington that the challenges in both the Pacific and Indian Ocean are connected, In practice, the Indian Ocean appears much less important in the Indo-Pacific equation than the Pacific. And in this context, the US remains the indispensable actor, of course, but local actors simultaneously seek closer ties with other actors and seeks to edge with China and look for other more regional partnership, if not alliances. So we have an interesting process of multipolarization in the Indian Ocean. I don't even know if the term multipolarization exists, but the fact is, this is the best description that I could find of what we see right now. We have a first layer of regional politics, namely the strategic triangle comprising China, India, and the US, but also a new layer which has only added complexity to the political landscape. As mentioned, the fragmentation of the Indian Ocean has enabled local players to cultivate their own ambition. Through the same, they can develop their military capabilities and initiate new partnerships. Now, let me give you very quickly a few examples. The rise of Gulf monarchies in regional affairs in the Horn of Africa or South Asia highlight precisely this multiplication of local players in the strategic affairs of the Indian Ocean. The countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council now nurture desire of some strategic autonomy, and I insist on the some strategic autonomy rather than the term itself. And by the way, strategic autonomy has never meant strategic autarky, so there is room for interpretation here. Likewise, ASEAN member states, at least those that are littoral states of the Indian Ocean, are also increasingly active. Traditional actors of the IOR like Indonesia, Malaysia, are indeed developing new ambition. Now, let's not exaggerate the scope of those ambitions. They do exist. They are limited by resources. They nevertheless count somehow in the dynamic of the region. Additionally, if the littoral states of the Indian Ocean are playing a more active role, external middle powers are also pursuing their own agenda in the area. I mean, we can speak of the Europeans. Not all of them are littoral states of the Indian Ocean, and they have been increasingly active. I mean, I'm referring to operations such as Atalanta, the effort made in specific fields such as MDA with Craimayo, which has led to the creation of the Seraphim in Madagascar and the Croc in the Seychelles, and so on and so forth. So these are real efforts that have been propped up by the European Union with the support of European actors. Now, the problem in this whole operation is that the security architecture of the Indian Ocean remains at best underdeveloped. The Indian Ocean Rim Association, the IORA, and its own and more special ways, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, the IONS, are merely talk shops. I mean, this is a euphemism to say that their achievements have been so far less than impressive. What does it mean for a country like France? It means that there is, at the same time, a need to continue to maintain its naval presence in the Indian Ocean, and it has done so through its pre-deployed force in La Réunion, which helped it monitor the Channel of Mozambique, for example, but also continue to deploy forces directly from the metropolitan France through, for example, the Jardin Group, who comes in the Indian Ocean annually, and there is not a single exception. And as we speak, the Charles de Gaulle craft carrier is actually entering the Indian Ocean. So there is a reality of the French naval presence in the area. There is a need to maintain military forces, and this need is acknowledged. But there is also an understanding that this is not enough, and that this has to be done in cooperation with littoral state of the region, in the region. This has been the case in particular with India since the early 2000s. Varuna is the typical exercise that we practice with India every 2 years. And this is an indication, and this is something which is growing qualitatively as well as quantitatively. So, this is typically the kind of relationship that France wants to continue developing. But it also exercises with other countries. And there is an attempt to start new relations with other countries. There is this emerging military relation with Indonesia. This is an example of that. There is also all the efforts done very discreetly by France in the southwest of the Indian Ocean through its regular presence there, which it intends to maintain, and so on and so forth. Now, there is also an understanding that unless there is a greater involvement, both operationally and politically, these efforts are likely to remain largely insufficient. So France also wants to mesh the Indian Ocean region much more than it had done by the past. There is a willingness to create that sort of web of webs that former Foreign Minister Shamshan was talking about when he referred to the Look-East policy of India in the region. That's a French and much more modest version of it, but there is the idea is more or less the same. And he's doing that through two very different line of action. There is the creation of the support to capacity building through, for example, the creation of this new Maritime Teaching and Research Center in Sri Lanka that was inaugurated last month, and which is expected over time to develop relation with similar things being done in La Réunion, for example. All that is open to regional cooperation and so on. This is what we do. There is a second dimension of it, which is France has joined the IORA in 2020, if I'm correct, December 2020, yes, exactly 4 years ago. And there is a willingness to help develop maritime affairs within IORA. So when France arrived, the first thing it did was to develop a project on, IUU fishing. It is about to start in January this year, a new set of operation on HADR. HADR, by and large, is about interoperability when we speak of the maritime domain, and this is exactly what France is about to do. There is a second aspect of it, which is similar action conducting within IONS. So we have the civilian dimension of it, we have the much more military dimension of it, and remember that the French chairmanship of the IONS was entirely dedicated to HADR. So these are two directions. They are definitely not enough. They are definitely not the whole thing. They indicate a policy, some sort of a systematic approach. Military, non-traditional approach, cooperation with states, and capacity building. These are the pillars of French action. I think this is what we believe is perhaps a step in the right direction, but the step in the right direction that will be only fulfilled if others participate as well. And I'll stop on that.
Okay, so thank you. I think that was really, really nice. You not only touched upon some big strategic ideas, turning our direction or our gaze to strategic ideas or the strategic landscape which is emerging, but also to some of, I would say, specific tactical steps by really taking the example of France. And I think, a couple of very interesting issues. And before moving on to the next speaker, I'll just highlight them. You talked about China being a game changer. Well, if you really look at how China really operates in Southeast Asia, this article by David Kang really brings me to this idea that he talked about, that in Southeast Asia, it was primarily hierarchy and not anarchy, which always was prevalent. And therefore, China, yes, while was present in Southeast Asia, I think what we really need to watch is the specificities of the assertiveness in China's rise. I think that is very interesting in terms of how the Chinese strategy is rightly emerging, as you said, within the webs of webs. And this really brings us to the blurring of the low politics, the divide between the low politics and the high politics. That itself, I think, is a very important gray area that you talked about by really taking the example of IUU fishing. Because again, what it really talks about is the complexity of solutions that we really need. Because there is a complexity of problems there will we need complex solutions in terms of responding. And there is where I guess, again, this contradiction that you talked about of multipolarity comes out, and one has to really see the webs of the webs, or a network strategy, as it is really emerging in the Indian Ocean region. And the third important point, which you rightly again point out as you start, perspectives are where we stand. And I think locations of these countries become very, very important. And in that context, some of the countries in South Asia, of course, everyone is analyzing India, everyone is analyzing China, but how do countries in South Asia are really looking at this? For instance, look at Bangladesh, look at Pakistan. Are they really following something like strategic autonomy, which you said is open to interpretation? Are they sort of, really trying to also adapt to hedging, as some of the countries in Southeast Asia do? Or there is a multi-engagement kind of a policy? So I think, for strategic watchers in the Indian Ocean region, while one really needs to understand how are different powers, middle powers, great powers, rising powers really emerging and responding to some of these issues, one also needs to, in fact, understand how is it that these small states are in fact negotiating, taking a stand, and putting their positions when it really comes to the issues around the Indo-Pacific. So I think this is really an interesting canvas, a strategic canvas which is emerging, which one will have to wait and watch. And something which has always compelled me is to really look at the webs of strategies which are emerging, and who are the key nodes, who are the key connectors, and how do we really make sense of the strategic space called the Indian Ocean. So with this, we now move on to the next speaker. Is Dr. Sitaram Mishra present? Is he there? Or else we move on to the third speaker, which is Dr. Mauro Bonavita. Dr. Mauro Bonavita is a lecturer in the King's College London. I did see him when we started this session. So may I now invite him? And if Dr. Bonavita, you can also perhaps share the title of your presentation, which will be very, very helpful. Over to you, and you have 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay, now it works. Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Sorry for these technical problems. So first of all, let me thank NIICE for the kind invitation to take part in this interesting conference about the Indo-Pacific. It's always a pleasure to interact with speakers both from Europe and the wider Indo-Pacific region, because this allows us to enrich our understanding, our common understanding, and to share ideas and our research about how things are evolving in this very pivotal region for the world. Like my previous speaker, Dr. Grare, I will try to focus on a European actor, in this case is the United Kingdom, try to understand how the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, which started under Boris Johnson in 2021, has evolved up to today with a new Labour government of Sir Keir Starmer, which has been elected in office a few months ago. So first of all, in order to contextualize the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, we need to go back to the traumatic experience of Brexit and the process that led the United Kingdom to leave the European Union with a very long negotiated process between Brussels and London around the final agreements that came into power at the beginning of 2021. At that point of time, the United Kingdom was under the government of Boris Johnson, and it was undergoing a strong readaptation to the new world reality, and particularly the need to understand the role of Britain as a power around the world beyond the European Eurocentric vision that had been, to a certain extent, very important for Britain in the way it sees itself and in the way it acted as a power around the world up to that time. So when Brexit occurred, the first reaction from the government was to promote the idea and the strategy of Global Britain, which was perceived as an attempt by the United Kingdom to reach out to different partners around the world in order to compensate to a certain extent what it has left behind from Europe, but also it was very much a domestic and an international attempt to create a positive narrative of that process and to show that Britain was capable of dealing with different partners from Europe. This is obviously something that you're still assessing a few years after that it has been promoted, and there's very much a mixed results from that policy. In 2021, just after that occurrence, the British government published the Integrated Review, which was the major strategic document since the end of the Cold War, which tried at the same time to give an understanding of what were the strategic priorities and aims of the nation in a new changing world where after the unipolar world there was an increasing global competition among great powers and middle powers, but also it was an attempt, again, as I said, to answer to the wider question about national identity and what was Britain's approach to the world. In this sense, we have two major shifts that the Integrated Review of 2021 showed. The first one was a general understanding of the importance of the Indo-Pacific as the growing world's center of gravity. So this strategic document showed that the British government has a very clear understanding of how important the Indo-Pacific was becoming for several reasons, in part because there was where the great power competition was taking place, but also because of growing economy being concentrated around the region, and of course the importance, if you want to be a global power that goes beyond Europe, to be present and to play to a certain extent the role there. The second important element that emerged from the 2021 Integrated Review was a new definition of China. Until then, the relationship with China has been very much under the framework of cooperation, and it has been the case for the rest of Europe. But at that point in 2021, China was defined as a systemic competitor for Britain, which is quite an insignificant definition that will have then a later impact on what was going to happen later. Britain in 2021 identified a very important commitment to the free and open Indo-Pacific, and with a clear support for international rule-based order. And of course, within this, it identified several key actors that operate around the Indo-Pacific, including ASEAN, Japan, Australia, and of course, India as partners with whom Britain could try to support the rule-based international order. Now, two different sets of priorities were very much identified along the need to support the structuring of the Indo-Pacific region. And to a certain extent, in 2021, the centrality of these two reasons were much equally important as the security one. The first one was the economic and development priority. In this sense, the UK identified the needs to strengthen its partnership with the region in order to make sure that the common prosperity that the British people were living could be sustained in the medium to long term versus the growing tensions that were happening, but also because of the new economic opportunities that were needed in terms of reaching out to different markets and to new emerging actors. Leaving behind the European Union common market, new avenues were pursued in terms of economic cooperation. One of them was certainly the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and of course several discussions about FTAs with several countries around the region. A second priority which emerged very clearly from the Integrated Review was the climate change and the impacts, the wider impacts that the climate change had in terms of not just the stability of the Indo-Pacific and therefore as a spillover all the other effects in terms of sustaining economic development and prosperity, but also the fact that very much this type of the impact that climate change would have would then have immediate effects in terms of security and therefore of a major or less involvement of the UK in the region, but also in terms, for example, of migration with direct effects to the European continent. At a structural level, we can say that The integrated review of 2021 address also another reason, which is not necessarily that clearly identified in the document. And this is the shift that the United Kingdom made around the US definition of the Indo-Pacific, given the growing great power competition that was going on in the region, and therefore a larger US attempt to define the ways in which the region operated and its priorities. We see certainly very much an adequation, a way in which the UK adequated and accommodated to a certain extent the US vision of the China threat and the Indo-Pacific. This is very much the case with the first great major initiatives that the UK government adopts already in 2021 in the Indo-Pacific, which is the deployment of the carrier strike group with the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier, which is a strong signal, both at a performative way, in a performative sense, to show that the UK is coming back to the region after many, many decades in a very strong way, connecting with regional partners. There has been several exercises of the aircraft carrier strike group with Japan, with Australia, with India, and of course the Republic of Korea. But also it is a clear way to show that the understanding of the priorities is not just a way to show to local powers that there is a return to the region, but also a very strong connection with security at a time when the United States were pointing out the increasing assertiveness of communist China as an actor. Now, the 2021 integrated review, which certainly, as we said, demonstrated a clear shift in a strategic understanding of the region, a clear definition of new priorities, which are not necessarily strictly connected to security, but also a wider recollocation of the United Kingdom within the great power competition, has been criticized immediately after its publication because of two major problems that immediately arise. The first one was the versus a certain type of definition of China as a strategic competitor. There was still the understanding that British politics was balancing to a certain extent its approach to China, and therefore, if on one side there was the clear sense of sending a strong message with the use of certain type of wording in the strategic document and with the deployment of an aircraft carrier, at the same time there were still very much economic and political connections to China. So this type of balance was not very clear in terms of where the document and how the document would have had influence this wider type of relationship between Beijing and London. At the same time, one of the criticisms, which is not just within Britain, but it has emerged also from around the region, was about the real resources that the British government would then commit to sustain the aims, the long-term aims that the strategy was implying. In particular, in terms of the continuous naval presence, again, the deployment of aircraft carrier with Queen Elizabeth was an important performative act to show a return there, when many countries around the region, in particular in the Indian Ocean region, were demanding what was then the long-term commitments in terms of support, not just for maritime security in a traditional sense, but also in terms of bolstering the capacities and capabilities of local powers for non-traditional maritime security and other initiatives. And this remained one of the major criticisms that was there. A third criticism that later on was raised and that drove the need for a change in the strategic document was the high, what was perceived as a high preference for performative initiatives, for definitions and speeches and narrative versus more practical and specific definitions of policies around the Indo-Pacific. A couple of years later, from the 2021 integrated review, we had a change of government, actually two governments, two successive governments, and in 2023, the Rishi Sunak's cabinet decided to try to address part of these issues with the publishing an integrated review refresh. So after the Cold War, we just had one major document in 2021, and then a couple of years later, the government felt the need to publish a new strategic document. Now, even if this may sound a little bit strange, we have to remember that, of course, 2023, so it's the year when all powers in Europe and around the world started to assess the tragic events of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how much that had altered the balance of power in the European continent, and therefore had an impact on the way in which medium powers around Europe had to understand the use of their priorities and their capabilities. So the 2023 integrated review tried to balance, to a certain extent, the need for Britain to be strongly present in the support of Ukraine, because that had a strong impact on its own immediate security, the risk that Europe might get in a major conflict and with the immediate consequences in terms of politics, domestic politics, economics for Britain, but also the need to send a strong, clear message around the world to powers which are not democratic in terms of the way they want to challenge international rule-based order, which is something that Britain was trying to support in the Indo-Pacific, and suddenly it became very clear that it was weak in Europe, even if in 2014 it had unfortunately already been quite clear by the Russian occupation of Crimea. So the 2023 integrated review tried to keep in balance this priority, this new priority in terms of European security, with the attempt by Britain to reiterate its commitment to the Indo-Pacific and the wider understanding that the Indo-Pacific was still a pivotal region in the world, and therefore the need for Britain to be very much present there. At the same time, we have two major elements that emerge in this strategic documents that shows very much deepening of the Indo-Pacific understanding and thought within Whitehall. The first one is a new definition for China. One of the characteristics, if you allow me to say this, of these strategic documents is that sometimes we forget that documents are written by words, and words are something which are very important because everyone goes and pick them and try to understand the different definitions and approaches to different words. So China, which was described in 2021 as a strategic competitor, has now been defined as an epoch-defining challenge, which therefore tries to broader and wider the understanding of the type of challenge and threat that China poses, but at the same time, it also probably has a more vague approach and understanding. 2023 is also the year when the strategic understanding of Britain changes along with that of the United States. It's the year when the ties with AUKUS, the new rapprochement and groupsment with Australia and the United States, become more relevant and more important. And this shows very much how at the structural level, the decision of the US to shift to a more integrated and structural partnership with certain preferred partners, in this case, Australia and the UK, is something that the UK also shares, not just in the program of submarines, which is the front office of AUKUS, but most importantly, within the framework of strategic initiatives that will, to a certain extent, contain China, not necessarily just diplomatically, but potentially through a security-oriented common approach. Also, the 2023 integrated review refresh gives a quite important space to cooperation, to structural cooperation with other partners. An example of this is the decision of the UK to co-lead along with India within the Indo-Pacific Ocean initiatives and maritime security pillars, which is an emerging framework that arises and has a strong impact specifically in the Indian Ocean region, which will have then certain type of implications. 2023 is also the year when Rishi Sunak is in power. A year later, there are general elections in the United Kingdom, which are won by the Labour Party. Now, 6 months before the general elections, within the circles of foreign policy in London, there has been a long discussion about the further implications of a potential Labour Party win in the general elections, in the sense that the Labour Party was very much perceived as being hostile to a certain extent to the strategic approaches which has been taken by successive government towards the UK's approach to the Indo-Pacific and widely to the UK's role after Brexit. And most importantly, there was a strong perception that the Labour Party would be a very much Europe-centric and Europe-focused administration. Now, we are still at the very beginning of this new Labour government. And of course, as you know, there has been the announcement by the Prime Minister of the need of a new strategic document, which would be the third strategic document in 3 consecutive years. But from what we can say and what we have read from the various ministers' speeches about the Indo-Pacific and the wider approach to foreign policy, which has emerged in the last 6 months, we can already start to make a general assessment of what is currently Britain's approach to the Indo-Pacific and what it will potentially look like in the future. So the first element is that the Labour cabinet is strongly is going through a clear paradox and contradiction. On one side, we see that there's very much an attempt to focus on Europe and people who are in power right now. They have been emerged as very much critics of global Britain because they perceive global Britain as more a political initiative than a strategic national strategy. In this sense, there is a strong understanding that global Britain was the creation of Boris Johnson, and therefore it has a very much party-oriented approach. At the same time, pragmatism and realism has been very much at the heart of the way in which the British government has operated in the last 6 months. And this has emerged very clearly by the fact that the Indo-Pacific has remained, at least in the speeches and in the initiatives, very much a priority for the British government. Recently, the Parliamentary Secretary for the Indo-Pacific at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has described 3 major priorities that the Keir Starmer's government has for the Indo-Pacific, and these are boosting economic growth, tackling climate change, and strengthening national and global security, which, with different words, are the same trends that we have seen consistently since the 2021 strategic integrated review strategic documents, of course. In general terms, we can say that the attempts by the British government to play a role has also been confirmed in the way in which it has taken care of the decision to find an agreement with Maldives about the Indian Ocean, the British Indian Ocean territory, which, as you know, it was announced a few weeks ago in London, which would probably see a sort of settlement to the dispute that has been ongoing for several decades around one of the last British territories in the Indo-Pacific and wider Asian region. And this decision has been not so much driven by some sort of ideological form within the British government, but very much has been seen as a necessary step in order to further boost and strengthen presence in the Indo-Pacific, within the Indo-Pacific region. Now, the 2024 change of government and the attempt to write a new strategic document, which will have a strong impact on the Indo-Pacific approach, of course, even though it seems to be very much in the continuity. It also comes at the time when Britain is rethinking again its role, and not so much this time in terms of excluding Europe from its core action or including it, but more broadly as one of the structural effects that emerged from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is very much at the heart of the idea of Britain as a security partner, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but in Europe, and the role of the armed forces and how security and military capabilities should be further boosted and structured around the country. So what we expect to see in the next few months with the publication of a new the new government document is what new type of definitions will be issued in terms of Indo-Pacific, how will China be described, what are the new aims and goals, and therefore long-term achievements that the government wants to pursue with its partners in the Indo-Pacific and specifically within the Indian Ocean region, and more importantly, how will it address, if it will at all, the criticism that has emerged from the two previous documents and are still very much there. And the first one being the limited resources in terms of participations to the Indo-Pacific, and more importantly, the role that a new middle power as the United Kingdom sees of itself. It's either by accommodating a US approach to the region and therefore becoming even more a special partner for the US in this region, or trying to pursue a more autonomous trajectory which will allow it to operate with different regional partners in support of the rule-based order that the US pursue, but also trying to support its own national economic interest within the region, providing regional actors with an alternative from the straightforward competition between US and China. I will stop here at this point. Happy to answer more of your questions in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was really an insightful presentation, particularly in terms of the analysis you took regarding analyzing the language, particularly in the strategic documents, which definitely make us understand the emerging British policy and the way it's positioning itself with issues in the Indo-Pacific. Now, I think on that note, I shall move on to the third speaker, Dr. Sitakanta Mishra. Dr. Mishra, you have 15 minutes, and I hope your microphone
Yeah,
is working
just to
now.
check it,
Over
am I
to you,
audible?
Dr. Mishra.
Am I audible?
You are. We
Okay.
can hear you. I wonder if you can hear us. Wonderful.
Yes, perfect. Okay, good morning from India to everyone, all the participants. I can see the renowned speakers here. And since the time limit is very strict and paucity of time, let me straight away go to the topic. Taking forward the discussion that Mauro Bonavita has already pointed out, the centrality of Indo-Pacific in the world politics today, I will focus on the nuclear dimension of Indo-Pacific geopolitics. And to my mind, there are specifically 3 or 4 dimensions of the nuclear geopolitics that is unfolding in this region, particularly Indo-Pacific. The first one is the presence of nuclear weapon states in this region. And of course, as a part of this nuclear geopolitics, nuclear energy programs in the region, which is rampantly progressing. So the first aspect that I'm trying to highlight is the presence of the nuclear weapon states in the region. The second dimension, to my mind, is the domino effect of the Ukraine-Russia war and the nuclear dimension in Indo-Pacific geopolitics. The third dimension, to my mind, is the non-proliferation and disarmament debate within the region. So all the 3 dimensions are actually global, but they are very much reflective today in Indo-Pacific. And one by one, very quickly, I'll highlight each of these dimensions. The first one that I mentioned about, that the presence of nuclear weapon states in the region, I think this is the region where almost all nuclear weapon states are present, at least 8 out of 9, or at least their policies are very much visible in this region. So nearly all nuclear weapon states are located in the Indo-Pacific region or have regular military presence there. So the delivery vehicles of nuclear weapons, that is missiles, both cruise and ballistic missiles, are spreading unabatedly in this region simultaneously. And as the region is amid a geopolitical churning, to my mind, any conflict in the region, no matter what small or big, will have definitely a nuclear dimension. And that's what my conclusion in the first section. Active conflict zones in the region sooner or later will escalate, leading to a major power conflict that I assume. And the existence of nuclear weapons and national policies involving nuclear weapons and technology transfer in the region make everyone actually nervous, and therefore this aspect requires urgent introspection. While introspecting on the contours of Indo-Pacific, nuclear discourse, the policies of the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, and North Korea must be taken into consideration, to my mind, because all these countries assert their role some or the other in the Indo-Pacific region, and therefore we must scrutinize each of the policies of each of these countries. If you look at the number of nuclear warheads in the today, if it is around 12,000 to 13,000 warheads that exist in the world by 2023, nearly 12,000 are actually present in this region. Besides, Japan and South Korea are also enjoying the extended nuclear deterrence, and that is called nuclear umbrella, offered by America to defend them amid growing nuclear threats from China and North Korea, respectively. It is speculated that if the situation warrants, both Japan and South Korea can also acquire nuclear weapons on a short notice. More importantly, the relationship between many countries in the region is mostly troublesome. And to accomplish the vision of free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific that my previous speaker was highlighting, regional groupings like ASEAN and Quad need to have de-risk nuclear threats urgently. On the other hand, as I mentioned, as a part of this nuclear discourse, many countries in the region are eager to develop nuclear energy. In fact, majority of the reactors under construction or the new connections in the world are actually located in this region. But what is interesting is, with strong government support, Russian and Chinese nuclear companies are capitalizing on this rising demand in the region, in a way controlling the nuclear energy drive in the region. And anybody can speculate if any conflict occurs in the Indo-Pacific theater in future, of course, Russia and China's stronghold over nuclear power plants would be a game changer. And that's what we need to focus on. Therefore, from all angles, the Indo-Pacific nuclear weapons discourse is likely to go through an awful situation if not addressed constructively. On the other hand, the region's nuclear energy production prospects look very promising, as many of the nations are really willing and looking for advanced nuclear technology like SMR, small modular reactors. Therefore, in one hand, the nuclear weapons discourse in the Indo-Pacific dimension looks very, very awful. At the same time, nuclear energy prospects are very much good in this region. Now, taking forward this debate to the other dimension, that is the domino effect of Russia-Ukraine war in the region, and which is much more important, and as of course a corollary of the first point that I mentioned, the number of nuclear weapon states present in this region. As I mentioned earlier, nearly all nuclear weapon states are present here. Almost 8 nuclear weapon states are present here, and there is a rapid spread of missiles in this region. So the region has active conflict zones, and relations among them are very troublesome. Therefore, everybody need to worry about, particularly if I point out the countries like North Korea, which poses the most pressing regional threat and adheres to a nuclear brinkmanship to repeatedly threaten South Korea, Japan, and US. As a result, all of them have deepened their extended nuclear deterrence arrangements. If the situation warrants, as I mentioned before, both Japan and South Korea may acquire nuclear weapons at short notice, and therefore, which will have domino effects in other parts of the world. China, on the other hand, poses a complex challenge by modernizing and building up its nuclear arsenal. China is now projected to increase its arsenal faster than originally anticipated to 1,500 nuclear weapons by 2035. China seems to have discarded its stated no first use policy or doctrine and minimum credible deterrence posture. It is also reluctant to engage in an arms control treaty with the United States and Russia. So the most direct and intense pressure on the nuclear taboo today comes from Russia since the unfolding of the Russia-Ukraine war. And Russian high officials have, including Putin, have repeatedly, threatened to use nuclear weapons. if NATO US support to Ukraine continues. There is a lot of speculation that Russia might use nuclear weapons to end the war as a last region, and this has prompted Ukraine to start, to state that had it not made the mistake of abandoning nuclear weapons it inherited from the Soviet Union, Russia would not have dared to actually invade it. So this has a lot of reverberation in the region. The Ukraine-Russia nuclear paradigm has actually found many echoes in the Indo-Pacific today. In Japan and South Korea particularly, they live in the nuclear neighborhood of China, North Korea, and Russia. And the nuclear weapons debate has been actually sharpened their domestic debate. The majority of South Korea now favor the acquisition of nuclear weapons as the way forward, beside allowing the development of US nuclear assets in the territory. And Japan, on the other hand, ponders over nuclear sharing arrangement with the United States, similar to NATO. So most importantly, to unify Taiwan militarily, if China makes similar ploy like what Russia has done with Ukraine, to deter US interference particularly, what option does Taiwan have? Can the nuclear option be far from Taiwan, which has already the know-how and 3 nuclear power reactors present in that country? Then if South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan acquire nuclear weapons, will China remain silent? It will certainly change the nuclear posture, and in turn, it will trigger a domino effect on India, which again will result in a spiral in Pakistan. So the Ukraine-Russia war has a cascading effect on the Indo-Pacific nuclear discourse that is very much clear. The other aspect that I will skip, that AUKUS that has come up, which has created also ripples in the region that we can discuss if time permits. So all these represent a profound geopolitical shift unfolding in the Indo-Pacific region. Which way it will turn is a matter of conjecture, but what is worrisome is the safety and security of nuclear assets, as chances of misuse and inadvertent use of nuclear assets cannot completely be sidelined. The third aspect, which quickly I'll finish, and that is Indo-Pacific region and nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament discourse. And as I told, number of nuclear weapons are present here, number of countries are looking for nuclear energy production. So definitely this region is the hotspot of nuclear dimension of the world. The multilateral regimes, particularly like NPT and CTBT, have very weakness in the region, and the basic multilateral and bilateral CBMs are at best haphazard or non-existent. The regional forums like ASEAN, Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, Quad, have yet to seriously grapple with nuclear threat reduction in the region, to my mind. I may be wrong, but that's what it seems from outside. For example, the 6-party talks to dissuade North Korea from nuclear weapons actually untimely failed. It didn't work. However, the Southeast Asian nuclear weapons free zone that we know is established since 1995 as Bangkok Treaty, is the only successful to some extent kind of CBM available to control the spread of WMDs. It affirms the importance of NPT in preventing proliferation of nuclear weapons, definitely. But when you look at the larger picture in Indo-Pacific, especially for the increased Russian and Chinese collaboration with North Korea and Iran, which places a major pressure on the NPT. With the collapse of the Iran nuclear agreement and the effort to forestall further growth of the North Korea's nuclear capability, pressures are now building up among the American allies for deeper assurance regarding the US nuclear umbrella on them. North Korea and Iran's nuclear program, actually combined with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, are also igniting debates in other nations about the viability of being a non-nuclear state. So the Indo-Pacific nuclear threats necessitates sustained dialogue. However, as China continues to try to drive the US out of the region, there is limited hope that effective CBMs can be negotiated. Last year, Putin suspended Russia's participation in the START treaty, which is now set to expire in February 2026. Meanwhile, China, with fast-growing nuclear capability, has no nuclear agreement on CBM with America or Russia. China is not in a mood to sign one. It has relatively fewer nuclear warheads, what it asserts, vis-a-vis US and Russia. Therefore, the position of Japan involving the treaty, therefore, the region is actually in a fix from non-proliferation disarmament point of view. And then the ban treaty, which was negotiated long ago, which is called Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, is actually seems to be not working at all. The only country in the world which is affected by the nuclear weapons, that is Japan, has taken a very different view on the ban treaty. Therefore, the non-proliferation, disarmament, and all these, CBM initiative in the region has not much effect, and therefore needs to be debated widely. I will stop here and will look forward to any further question that comes up to discuss. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mishra. I was unable to unmute myself. The system wasn't allowing me. But I think that was really fascinating in terms of you, again, turning our gaze to these multiple scenarios which can open up, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. And specifically, I think when it comes to the dual use of nuclear technology, in the context of energy transition to climate change. So I think there is an intersecting complex canvas which one really needs to understand and be attentive to. We don't have much time. We spent, in fact, a lot of time was just gone in terms of changing rooms. But now I would like to invite the last speaker, Ms. Urvi, to present her views. And over to you, Ms. Urvi. Are you there?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So I am Urbi Das. I teach in the capacity of being an assistant professor in the Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. So my paper or my article tries to assess this Indo-Pacific maritime trade game and what can be the prospect for US-India collaboration in this regard. So basically, I would like to start by saying that what is Indo-Pacific and how do we see this particular century as? So this century is not a century of perpetual peace as one would have understood or one would have wanted, but have arrived with the cloak of uncertainty. The world sees a crowded horizon of risk ranging from Middle East to the Asian waters, from crisis to war, from security threats and challenges from traditional to non-traditional security threats. Okay? And one thing I would like to recall the understanding of Rory Metcalf on mental maps. So in statecraft, what happens? Mental maps matter. So relation between states and competition or cooperation, they ultimately involve a state or the landscape of a mind. And this defines each country's natural regions. It also equates to what academics call a strategic system or a regional security complex. That is a part of the world where the behavior of one or more powerful states has a more strong and inescapable impact on the interest of other countries. So Indo-Pacific is basically what a nation imagines on a map as its own strategic area of interest. And here it is a marker of what a nation considers to be the most important. So mental maps are basically about powers. So Indo-Pacific, the landscape, strategic landscape of Indo-Pacific is all about how nations look into the power sector or their natural area of operation in the 21st century. So why has the Indo-Pacific area come about to be the most important arena? So this is where we have the confluence of two oceans, which are the lifelines of the world's trade and commerce, and it accounts for 2/3 of the global economic growth. The waters of the South China Sea are very much strategically relevant and also economically relevant because they are rich in fish and are thought to be a source of extensive hydrocarbon resources. We have three of the world's largest economies here, the US, China, and Japan, and it accounts for 60% of the global GDP, and they have stakes attached to it. It is home to about 38 countries of the world, accounting for 62% of the global GDP. And it is a place where 65% of the world's population reside, including 58% of global youth. So all this make up this region a hub of global economic growth. So Indo-Pacific links the idea of strategy with the idea of economic prosperity. And this is what is attracting the countries all over. Having said this, I would like to talk about that what sort or what importance that the Indo-Pacific has in the maritime trade game, or how is the strategic context of the Indo-Pacific evolving. So we all know that the region's strategic importance has intensified due to China's maritime assertiveness, particularly in the South China Sea. Its Belt and Road Initiative seeks to extend its influence through infrastructure investment. So these developments are actually prompting or alarming countries like India, US, Japan, and Australia, and they're trying to counterbalance China's rise. This maritime great game in the Indo-Pacific refers to the context or contest of influence and control over the region's maritime domain. It involves strategic alignments, naval modernization, and establishments of partnerships to ensure freedom of cooperation, freedom of navigation, uphold rules-based order, and counter any kind of hegemonic tendencies. So within this context, India and US have evolved as strategic players or key partners. Now to talk about that, what sort of importance or what sort of strategic convergence that they have, I would like to talk about first about the maritime challenges that both of them face, which compel them to come together. The Indo-Pacific regions have a complex array of maritime challenges. Many of them stem from geopolitical rivalries, resource competitions, and non-traditional security threats. One of them, the most important of them, as I have already said, or my former speakers have also pointed out, is the territorial disputes that is there alongside the South China Sea region in particular. The problem of nine-dash line having led conflicts which have led conflicts between and among the neighboring countries, and also includes the militarization of the artificial islands and the undermining of the freedom of navigation. Along with this, these two countries are also concerned with the People's Liberation Army's Navy, which has significantly increased its capabilities, military builds up, including blue water operations, threatening the balance of power in the region. Along with this, the Indo-Pacific contains some of the busiest shipping lanes, including Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea. So any disruption in these critical waterways would lead to disputes or blockages that could have severe economic consequences. Coupled with this, there is non-traditional security threats like the maritime piracy, like the maritime crime, armed robbery at sea, the trafficking of drugs, arms, humans, remain persistent challenges, particularly in the areas of Malacca Strait and the waters near the Horn of Africa. Along with this, we also have reporting of illegal fishing and unregulated fishing. So overfishing and illegal fishing have threatened the livelihood of a number of people, and this is common to all these countries, but the livelihoods of coastal communities and maritime diversity are entirely dependent. So Chinese fishing fleets have often been accused of this illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in the EEZs of the smaller nations. Along with this, we also have the problem of rising sea levels, cyclones, persistent cyclones, and other maritime climate-related changes that threaten the coastal nations, which require enhanced disaster preparedness and response mechanisms. The increasing reliance on digital infrastructure for maritime cooperation exposes vulnerability of the problem of cyber attacks on ports, the shipping companies, and the naval assets. So all this can be countered through US-India collaborations on securing these maritime challenges. So this can include maritime exercises under the Defense and Naval Cooperation, joint exercises like the Malabar exercise, which involve navies of India, US, and other Quad nations such as Japan and Australia. These exercises have been continuous and have a focus on anti-maritime submarine warfare, anti-submarine warfare, mine detection, and ensuring freedom of navigation. Secondly, we have a lot of military agreements between these two countries, something like LEMOA, Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, which allow reciprocal access to bases, facilitating naval operations and logistics. Then we have COMCASA, the Communications, Compatibility, and Security Agreement, which enables secure communication and data sharing during operations. We all know the importance of cyber attacks and data, how information and data have been critical sources of power in this 21st century. The next point is maritime domain awareness. The US supports India's maritime building efforts in maritime domain awareness through the provision of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance technologies. The two countries collaborate in real-time sharing of data to monitor maritime threats. We also have built up the Quad Information Fusion Center. So India's Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region, which is also known as the IFC-IOR, it serves as a platform for the Quad countries to enhance their maritime domain awareness and monitor maritime trafficking and incidents. Joint patrol and operations in the Indian Ocean. This is very important to counter illegal piracy and prevent these illegal fishings and in the area, and also to counter any kind of maritime disaster or any kind of underpreparedness by any one nation can be tackled by both nations collaborating together to providing technical and logistical support for maritime security. The US and India have come together for capacity building and training exercises, and regular training exercises are conducted to enhance naval capacities, including joint operations, search and rescue missions, and disaster response. India benefits from US technology transfers and assistance in modernizing its naval fleet, particularly in areas like aircraft carriers and submarines. Along with this, infrastructure connectivity. Through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, India and the US are working to improve maritime infrastructure and connectivity, offering alternatives to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Here, projects focus on building resilient ports and improving the supply chains. The Indo-US partnership extends to technological critical for maritime security, including unmanned systems, underwater drones, space-based surveillance systems. These technologies, they improve detection and tracking of maritime threats. Along with this, India and US are looking for support from multilateral institutions. Both nations support ASEAN-led mechanisms like the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN-led Regional Forum to address regional disputes and promote maritime security. The Quad's Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness focuses on providing smaller nations with real-time data and resources to secure their maritime territories. So with all these coupled with the joint initiative for climate change and disaster response, can work together in enhancing and the securitization and securitizing the entire Indo-Pacific region. So we see that India and the US have emerged as critical partners in addressing the diverse maritime challenges in the Indo-Pacific. Their joint efforts in defense, maritime, and domain awareness, capacity building, and multilateral engagement, they aim to uphold the rule-based order and ensure regional stability. So we see India and the US look eye to eye on each other's issue and share the common concern for respect for the nation's sovereignty, rule-based order, and regional stability in the Indo-Pacific region. So their partnership not only enhances their individual security, but also provides smaller maritime nations in their region with the support needed to navigate the complexities in the entire region. So what we see is that the Indo-Pacific has become a central theater for the entire transition that might take place. However, the stability and the rule-based order, the sovereignty and the equality of all nations is what brings the US and India together, and they work together for not only the betterment of each other, but for the betterment of the democratically oriented and nations who are looking toward a peaceful and a rule-based order in the entire Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Das, and thank you for, in fact, completing on time. We do have some time for questions and answers. And I think Dr. Das rightly invoked the notion of imageries. And I think that really has a critical relationship with the cartographic imagination of the Indo-Pacific. I think I had invoked Sugata Bose's thoughts right at the start of the session. And I think as we really talk about the intersection of and the interplay of different powers, it's also very important to think of what meaning does this have to countries who are sitting at different locations with very different power differentials. And I think this session itself has indeed done justice to its larger theme of Indian Ocean and maritime security. We did see the multiple challenges ranging from high politics, low politics, and there is no neat categorization or no neat binary between them. It's really a gray zone, and it's within these gray zones that countries are also coming in, stepping in, and really trying to forward the individual national interests. So I think on that note, I'll open it for a for the Q&A. I would request the organizers to unmute every. The participants can also write their questions in the chat box, and our speakers can respond to them. Any questions? Do we have any questions? Well, no one is responding, but I do see we do have a good audience there. And maybe then what we could do is, because we also had this, there was this disconnect in between when we were really changing rooms. Okay, so there is one question. I would like to read it for everyone's benefit. This is by Mahadevan Shankar, and his question is: how does the cyber attacks impact maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, specifically relating to critical infrastructure? Maybe we can just have one response from each of the panelists, very short. Dr. Grare, would you like to take a lead on this, on critical infrastructure?
Well, is that on cyber attack on critical infrastructure? I mean, cyber
Yes.
attack clearly can affect just any infrastructure existing, and therefore create a problem for the host country of the infrastructure. So, you know, that's a cyber attack. You can block a port, you can block many things, you can block an airport. So this impact maritime security in the Pacific. You can also attack all the control of the traffic and so on. So in very practical terms, it has many immediate implications and so on. But I mean, I'm sure there'll be people who will answer that question much more competently than I just did.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Any other response from the panelists?
Can I come in here?
Oh, please do. Yes.
Yeah. I think that's one very important aspect of the Indo-Pacific geopolitics. If you look at the gray zone activities, particularly by China, in that region has a major cause of concern for all of the members. Particularly in the maritime domain, China uses a tactic called gray zone activity. Jamming the radars, small bits and pieces, pushing the passerbys to a brink, doing some small nuisance below the threshold, which is called the gray zone activities. That involves also the cyber issues, which is a major cause of concern, and that needs to be, I think, sorted around the regional level. That's one response that I wanted to give.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mishra. That was very helpful. Anyone else?
Yeah, if I may add,
sure.
Am I audible?
You are.
Okay. So cyber attacks, they are significantly important, or they impact maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. They can target critical maritime infrastructure. They can disrupt operation. They can pose even national security risks. For example, the port of Singapore, which you know is one of the busiest ports in the world, they experienced multiple cyber intrusions, raising concerns about potential disruption to the critical operations and the flow of global trade. Then, if you talk about espionage and data theft, this is very important. So, maritime cybersecurity breaches can expose sensitive commercial and military information. So, this is especially relevant in the case of Indo-Pacific, where maritime disputes and naval activities are prominent. So, you have also the example of Chinese hackers that reportedly targeted Australian maritime networks, aiming to gather intelligence on naval operations and undersea cable systems. So, these are the examples, and we also talk about supply chains. So the vulnerabilities of supply chain that you can have in this regard, okay, it's very critical. So these are a few examples of how cyber attacks can impact your maritime security, especially when you talk of Indo-Pacific, because we talk of securitization. So the idea of securitization goes back to not only the military security, but also economic, environment, people, society as a whole. So if you talk it as a whole, so it's about securing your entire assets that lead to your growth and lead to security of your society, of your people. So here, cyber attacks and you know how now in today's world, data and information is the coin of power. It's one of the important coins of power, if not the sole. So this is how the maritime cyber attacks and maritime security are linked in the Pacific.
Thank you, Dr. Das. I think that was very helpful. We have another very interesting question, and this is from Abhinav. He says that,
Dr. Bisht. Sorry, I apologize for interrupting. Can I just react to this?
Okay, all right, please do. And then we can move on to the second, the last question.
Of course. Just very briefly, because I think my colleagues, all of them, raise a very interesting point about the issue of cyber attack and how important it is. Let me make a step forward, in the sense that one of the elements that we learned from the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the increasing type of threat that we have in terms of multi-domain from hostile actors, which are not just present in Europe, but also around the Indo-Pacific. So one of the major issues here, we all understand that this is an important element because it has an impact, as my colleague said, in a hybrid way, and it's difficult sometimes to attribute this kind of attacks to our enemies and our adversaries. So how do we react to all of this, given that we understand that this has an impact on our infrastructure? The first answer to this is that we have a very difficult situation in the Indo-Pacific because we have certain countries which have already developed a certain type of capabilities. It is the case certainly of advanced countries like India, Japan, Australia, which are working and have the resources to work on it. But we also have a series of countries which are very much under this type of threats, but do not necessarily have, at the moment at least, capabilities to do so. So one of the key elements in terms of cooperation, especially related to the maritime domain in a broader sense, and in this the European powers and some of us have brought this issue, is very much in this aspect. So how can cooperation move forward also to include cyber domain and potentially multi-domain type of threats that you can face? And sometimes you see that the type of cooperation that is going on depends on the country. Sometimes it's very still at the initial phase because of political reasons and because of the investments that external powers need to make to support the strengthening of capabilities, but also because you need still to raise the maritime domain awareness and to understand how all these elements connect, and also for external powers who wants to operate in the region to understand the specific abilities of each countries and to try to work with them at their pace and with their priorities. So I would say we all understand that this is a priority, but then how do we make this operative is a much more complex issue. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. I think that was really a useful addition. We have another question, and because primarily one of the major actors that everyone talked about was China. And this question says, what do you think about the development of maritime infrastructure in Indian Ocean and its contribution in addressing the geopolitical rivalry between China and India? And I think in particular, he's talking about the Grare Canal, which is also known as the Thai Canal. It's a Chinese initiative. If we can have some specific inputs on this. Dr. Grare, would you like to respond to this?
Let me say I'm a bit surprised by the question for two reasons. A, the Grare Canal is still so far an aspiration. Let's see what comes out of it. B, well, actually, critical infrastructure do not play a role in addressing the geopolitical rivalry. It is the instrument of geopolitical rivalry. So, we see that everywhere. We see that in Sri Lanka. We see that even in the Maldives, or even to that matter in Bangladesh. There is clearly zero-sum competition between India and China on the issue of infrastructure. Obviously, China is leading the way, but it's created such problem occasionally that it gives, in a very paradoxical way, room for India to come back in a game where it had acquired a certain advantage. But I mean, we're not talking of addressing the geopolitical rivalry. We're talking of fueling it, because this is by which it is. And that's very important because that illustrates everything which has been said on the Indo-Pacific. We're no longer talking primarily of military thing. We're talking of the weaponization of everything, to just quote the India's Foreign Minister in his last book. And that's precisely the way it's happening. And the mechanism is very simple. If you want to change from an infrastructure A to an infrastructure B, you need to invest. Investment means debt. Debt means creditors. And creditors do whatever they want with they own and the way they exercise pressure on the debtors. So this is the way things are being played. We're far from a military mechanism, but this has a very, very, very serious impact.
Absolutely. So thank you. I think these are questions for which we would require another session. But I must say that I totally enjoyed being the chair of the session. It was really an educative exercise. And I think to our participants also out there, there are issues, there are actors, there are vulnerabilities, there are interests. And I think any strategic watcher of the Indo-Pacific region should be aware of these emergent challenges. This also brings us to the end of the session on Indian Ocean and maritime security. And on that note, I would like to thank all the panelists for their very lucid, intelligent, perceptive comments on the Indian Ocean region. On that note, I would also like to thank NICE for hosting this conclave, which I think really brings in together all the Indo-Pacific experts. And definitely this will lead to the better understanding of the region for people who are working on this in different parts of the world. So on that note, I think we can close off the session.